story of the decline of Ireland's forests, a broadleaf temperate rainforest, is about the use of the forest and its replacement with grassland and tillage, and very recently with tree farming. But more fundamentally, it's about the relationship between humanity and the environment and a disconnect from nature. But trees, like this one here, are witness to a forest past and testify that the Irish people are a forest people without the forest. So where did the forest go? And how did it come about that tree farm plantations are called forest? About 10,000 years ago, the ice freed Ireland of its grip, and slowly sea levels rose, so that the tree species that white colonised the Ireland before those last land bridges with Britain and the continent went under water, rooted what was to become over millennia ancient forest. When the first settlers arrived, they would have found a country covered in established forest with different concentration of mixed species depending on soil type, ground moisture levels and elevation. People would have found a tree canopy unbroken except by rivers and lakes that stretched from coast to coast, north to south, and a roof composed of oak, elm, pine and hazel on better soils, and alder and birch on marginal ground. These hunting and gathering people would have moved around our lake shores and coasts, along the edges of the forest, and that high forest lay almost completely untouched until about 5,000 years ago. Around that time, the first farmers arrived in Ireland, overlapping with the development of blanket bog, which swallowed up areas of forest, so that the continuous canopy began to decline slowly. Large areas of forest were cleared by these people at a time when the climate altered to encourage bogland expansion downward from mountains and upwards from valleys until enormous areas of bog land developed. What are you doing there, Ted?
Well, Dennis and myself are measuring this very magnificent great oak, the largest oak in the barony of Muskerry. I believe the largest girthed oak that I know of in County Cork. I'm quite familiar with the woodlands and the remnant wildwood tree. This is a remnant wildwood tree. This is not a planted tree. Check it out.
So when you say remnant now, what do you mean? Can you just explain that to me?
It's a primary tree. It's the last of the wildwood.
The last of the wildwood. Okay. So and then approximately how old? I know it's a guesstimate, but how old would this tree be?
Well, I took a measurement with Kevin, my friend, my colleague, the environmental biologist Kevin Corcoran. We measured this in the year of 1984.
Right.
It's 30 years ago.
30 years ago, yeah.
And it was, and I measured it recently again. What are we getting, Dennis?
6 meters 100.
6.1.
Yeah. 6.1 meters.
6.1 meters. That's 601 centimeters, isn't it?
100.
610.
Yeah.
610.
10 centimeters.
Well, the tradition, the National Botanic Gardens, they go by a solitary tree is 2 centimeters per year, and within the forest 1.5 centimeters per year.
That's the rate of growth, is it, per year?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It doesn't work with old age pensioners. It doesn't work with veterans.
Yeah.
This tree stopped growing. It has not put on a millimetre in 30 years.
Okay.
So we have to review. It's possible that we Rackham and David Cabot tell us there's 1/5 of 1% left of the ancient wildwood within the 20 million acres of Ireland.
Okay. 1/5 of 1%.
1/5 of 1%.
Okay.
Professor doubly PhD Oliver Rackham, the authority in Ireland, I've met him several times, fortunately, and he says that these are very, very rare remnants.
Yeah.
These are true descendants from the earliest post-glacial wildwoods that came in after the Ice Age.
Around the birth of Christ, the forest was not able to swallow up, like it had so many times before, areas that were being cleared by people that really were in fact of the Wood Age, rather than Stone Age, Bronze Age, or Iron Age. So essential were trees, wood and timber in every aspect of human life. After all, it was wood that underpinned in so many ways each of these eras. And while it is their achievements in stone, bronze and Ireland that we celebrate today, it is the forest in no small way that facilitated the advancement of humanity, paying the price by disappearing and being forgotten. An agricultural people are remembered, but not a forest people.
As Mary McAleese pointed out in 2000 to me when she was planting a tree to mark National Tree Week in 1999.
Yeah.
She gave a little talk about being a forest people, and I was very impressed because, of course, the Irish language is based on the alphabet of 18 letters, all pronounced after the tree. Like the Irish for D is not, there's no such thing as ABC in Irish. It's be, col, dar. Be, B, birch. Col, C, hazel. D, dar, oak. So that all of our 18 letters in the primitive alphabet that give us the modern Gaelic language. So I often feel we'll never resuscitate Europe's first settled language, the Irish language, until we go back to its roots and understand truly we are a forest people without a forest.
Yeah, that's,
you know.
and like you're even saying that the language itself, the Irish language, is rooted in the forest, in the trees. So
Oh yes.
It's important to also be aware, of the significance of this tree, in that it was here at a time when Ireland had about 75%, maybe 70% tree cover or forest canopy, consisting of trees that had been here since the Ice Age, 10,000 years, of a succession, I suppose, of species arriving in Ireland as the ice melted, till eventually an oak canopy. So you had, I suppose, a very large percentage of Ireland under what's called ancient forest, much longer than Europe, because the Romans destroyed most of the ancient forests of Europe. So Ireland up to the 1600s still had, into the 1700s, pockets of very valuable ancient woodlands.
If the few ancient trees left in Ireland today could talk, I doubt they could distinguish between flags of different clans or invaders, pagan or Christian, be they Danes or Norwegians, the Normans, the Tudors or planters or Catholic peasant or Presbyterian. The woodsman's axe had done the same damage. The story of the deforestation of Ireland, despite the importance of it, has had little academic or political attention paid to it since 1922. But with the maturation of Conifer plantation in the 1960s, a number of important works dealing with the subject have since been published. Most notable, Eileen McCracken's Irish Woods Since Tudor Times in 1971, Owen Neeson's A History of Irish Forestry, and Nigel Everett's The Woods of Ireland 700 to 1800, published in 2013. McCracken and Everett disagree on when the sudden decline of the ancient forest came, Nigel believing that pre-colonial farming was far more intensive and at earlier times than McCracken. Whether Nigel Everett or Eileen McCracken's book is more accurate does change our understanding that Gaelic Ireland was a society much less demanding on nature and even protective of it. In Gaelic Ireland, ownership of the land was common, inclusive of the forest, very unlike the Norman concept of individual, private ownership. Agricultural practice was probably less intensive, the population smaller, and the importance of the cow for its milk all the more central to a rural economy.
If you're looking towards trying to find out when the decline came, you're constantly having to go back. And it became fairly clear that the traditional argument that it happened with the Tudors and Stuarts wasn't convincing.
you're saying it was well underway before the Tudors intervened, if you like.
I think the efficiency of kind of Gaelic or pre-plantation farming has been underestimated, and the extent to which the country was cleared, the extent to which it was efficiently farmed, has been underestimated. I think there's been a tendency to think of the sort of native population as being sort of barbaric people going around the woods, and suddenly appearing to do battle. The landscape appears to have been very deliberately managed. There was a large export trade to Europe, particularly to Spain, and that export trade was fundamental to the whole series of political and economic alliances that the country had. You find that when the Tudors and Stuarts really started to survey the land, they found that they were dealing with very disappointing levels of woodland.
So really, there was, I think you mentioned earlier on, 3 to 4% was left by the time the Tudors kind of got.
Well, You know, Eileen McCracken's figure was 12.5%,
Yeah.
which suggests that there'd been quite a lot of felling already.
Okay. Yeah. Even that number is
Even
still
that
low.
number, yeah. The figure of 3% seems to be more likely.
Yeah.
And I think what you had was a series of woodlands that were poorly placed in order to be exploited, far away from rivers and the sea. And in some cases, the communications were subsequently improved, as in the woods of Shillelagh.
Yeah.
But on the whole, you had a small number of woods. You had a long period of intensive use, and you had people who were very keen to, on the whole, to as much to conserve what they had as much as destroy it. And so there is a large amount of government attempts to stop the clearance of woodlands, something which hadn't existed in the previous centuries.
You know, the idea that the vast areas have been cut down before the Normans is, I don't think it adds up at all.
Okay.
Now, we don't have written records. The Irish didn't keep written records of the forest. Was part of their authentic landscape, so they would not have seen a need to be recording how much of it there was.
Yeah.
There's reference to in the Annals of the Four Masters to some fairly large areas of forest in different parts of Ireland, like vast forests, and then in between you would have small pockets and areas dotted around the country. Eileen McCracken, in her book Woodlands of Ireland, she maintains pre-Cromwell there was still 1/8 of the country under primeval.
Okay. 12.5% or thereabouts, which is still a significant amount
of primeval woodlands.
Primeval woodlands. Okay.
Yeah, that would be again woodlands that have continuously been there since the Ice Age, or after the Ice Age. And that was again after a period of the Elizabethan Wars of extensive, you could say, deforestation as well, for military purposes, to defeat the Irish that were fighting from the forests.
Right.
And you also had the beginning of speculators coming here, being granted lands before Cromwell. Sir Walter Raleigh was granted 20,000 acres of wood in Cork. Vast area, which subsequently was bought by Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork, who became so rich from the sale of that wood at 1 shilling per sound oak. He became the richest man in the United Kingdom. He was able to loan the English king 15 grand at the time,
which was a huge amount of money at the time.
Yeah, and buy himself into titledom. I think he's connected with Lismore.
He would be part of the cabinet.
He became a wealthy, bought himself a title basically.
But there's two things going on, and there's those likes of Boyle enriching himself, and also the byproduct of that was the removal of the forest to make the natives more to make it more control, and easier to.
And also then England was expanding its empire at the same time. It was looking to use Ireland as a food production area to feed its empire, and to, again, it's not very well known, but as the colonization of America began in the early 1600s, the colonies were the provisions for the colonies were coming from Ireland.
All right. So a lot of the
beef, butter,
right,
salted, and huge industry develops in making casks, barrels.
They had to be packed and transported.
Yeah. And it just going back to Sir Walter Raleigh, that's late 1500s, he's awarded these woods. So there was more than Walter Raleigh being granted gifts of huge amounts in the late 1500s.
Yeah.
Those forests seem to have been gone by the time of the petty surveys. And in a history of Clare by the Reverend White, he's talking about that in the period of the 17th century. He has quotes from old people interviewed, anecdotal evidence of their lives when they were young, which is pre-Cromwell.
Yeah.
And they talk of spending 3 days. At one of them was talking as a young man, being sent out to find the cattle.
Right.
To have to spend 3 days looking for cattle. The cattle were browsing.
Yeah.
as they are. Cattle originally are woodland browsers,
Yeah.
which explains why they go mad for the hedgerow
Right.
when they
So
get out of the
very
field.
different to the field system that we.
Yeah,
that would
it
be
tells
familiar
us the farming was integrated into the forestry, and that coincides with early Irish farming. Fergus Kelly describing cattle and pigs being fed on acorns,
with. Right.
and the Annals of the Four Masters describing some years where the mast was so thick that people were wading knee deep
Right.
in acorns.
In acorns in the autumn.
And this would have made the meat very, very tasty. The cattle and pigs were also eating the herbs, the
Right.
herbiage, which also enriched the meat.
Right. So very different meat to what
Very
we.
different meat and different farming methods,
Yeah.
and also the people were living in clearings in the woodlands and had a very close, direct relationship with the forest.
Even if McCracken's figures are more accurate than Nigel Everett's, the figure is still small enough to question a national belief that it was the English who cut the Irish forest down. Nigel's 4% or Eileen's 12% of original forest still standing in 1650 tell us that already much of the original ecosystem was long gone. There is, though, plenty of evidence to support the belief that what forest was standing was cleared rapidly as part of a military policy by England to secure the colony. Forest destruction deprived the rebel Irish of cover and supplied the colonisers with a cheap supply of high quality timber, and then the land for intensive agricultural production. Elizabeth I is known for expressly ordering the, quote, destruction of all woods in the country to deprive the Irish of this shelter. Ireland too was Catholic, strategically well placed between the powers of England, France and Spain, all with interest in the New World. So the forest was gone, and many species with it, including the wolf becoming extinct in the 18th century and the wild boar several centuries before that. Luckily, tiny pockets of the forest ecosystem have survived, so that these pockets of woodland are of huge value, and it is in the hedgerows of Ireland, which we take so for granted, that gives us the patchwork of landscapes of fields and boundaries that the seed bank of that much older ecosystem remains. Between 1650 and 1800, when the last of Ireland's forest was felled, Ireland's landscape seized the establishment of the Protestant ascendancy with the construction of great houses and the domains and parklands they were surrounded by. Maybe it's ironic that it is the descendants of the planters that inherited large estates of treeless land that took the first steps towards forest restoration. Initially, estate replanting was disorganised and uncoordinated, but became so with the foundation of the Dublin Society in 1731. It later became the RDS. Between 1766 and 1803, 25 million trees were planted with that organisation's support, which paid £90,000 in awards and medals. Exploitation of the forest, though, had been so severe that private means would not be enough. With centralisation of power in London by the Act of Union in 1801, meaningful tree planting in Ireland dwindled away. Ireland would be an agricultural producer. It's in the 19th century that the forest estate held by Cuilche has its origins, despite hardly a tree being planted. That century was dominated by a struggle for and control over the land. It was a time of decline of the landlord system, of Catholic emancipation, the Great Famine, huge emigration and desperate poverty, and it also saw the rise of the small farmer, long disinherited from his land. But the Gaelic revival and the growing strength of the nationalist agenda, led by leaders such as Charles Stewart Parnell, that fired real interest and passion in the value of Ireland restoring a forest. The interest was matched by the realisation by landed gentry and by the government that the country was obviously missing its forest resource. So why has monocrop conifer plantation dominated Irish forestry policy from the late 19th century right through to the present day? There are three reasons. Firstly, as we have said, what happened in the UK would affect Ireland. In Britain, in the early part of the 19th century, tree planting was becoming dominated by conifer because conifer was accepted to be faster growing and adequate to need. Secondly, linked to changes in tree species was the acceptance of a methodology of forestry called the German uniform system, simply a systematic and industrial approach to growing trees. And thirdly, in the naval battle of Hampton Roads during the American Civil War, the battle between the North's Monitor and the South's Merrimac, both new generation battleships called ironclads, an end to the era of wooden battleships was clearly signalled. Almost instantly, a centuries-old tradition of nurturing oak and royal forests for naval shipbuilding ended. The British Navy would have to go iron. Aside from the coniferisation of forestry policy towards the end of the 19th century, and although little was planted then or well into the 20th century, another powerful force would affect great influence on the development of forestry policy prior to and after the emergence of the Irish Free State. The Land Reform Acts and the breakup of landlord estates saw the return of the small farmer after hundreds of years, and he was primarily concerned with farming, not forestry. In fact, so thoroughly had the link between man and tree been broken that for the small farmer, trees were something that he associated with the domain of his former master, the landlord class, because it was these spaces around the great houses that had been built in the 18th century that held the only woodland left in the country. As part of the Union, what happened in the UK would affect Ireland. Looking back, because the country had little forestry, and when there was real passion and widespread interest in the re-establishment of Irish forestry, it was a pity that a more enlightened, more sensitive and longer term approach wasn't taken. Perhaps if our native tree species had informed species choice, we might today have inherited a resource far richer than we have. Looking back though, we do have to realise that there was virtually no tree resource in Ireland, and at a time when awareness that there had once been a rich broadleaf forest across the country, aspiration was better than none to try to correct the imbalance for the sake of establishing a timber resource, at least. But to give some idea of the complexity of the situation, the Estates Commission, who administered the Land Acts, were acquiring properties with plantations and forestry on them, but had no authority to keep these woodlands, while the newly established DATI, the Department of Agricultural and Technical Instructions, were trying to preserve these stands of wood, but didn't have the necessary finance. In this period, the emerging Irish forestry policy was a second-class citizen, subservient to many competing interests. Nonetheless, progress was being made. The prestigious Irish Forestry Society was established in 1900, and in 1902 Parnell's Avondale estate was purchased, with the opening of a school there in 1906. Also in 1903, Professor John Nisbet of the West of Scotland Agricultural College, commissioned by DATI, found that 1/5 of Ireland, thought to be the agricultural wasteland, could be profitably planted with forestry. Nisbet recognised the need for state ownership of large-scale forestry projects. It wasn't until 1948 that a big increase in tree planting occurred, referred to as the McBride expansion, led by Sean McBride and Bowler Hobson. McBride had made the case for a real expansion in conifer planting and the development of a comprehensive forestry policy, a precondition for participation in the 1948 government. The Cameron Report, commissioned by the Food and Agriculture Organisation, was published in 1950 and stated Ireland was the poorest country in Europe in terms of forestry. Thanks to the single-handed efforts of McBride, Hobson and others, in the face of a state slow to recognise the advantages of forestry, that by the 1960s a sizable tree crop was coming on stream. In 1988, Quilty was established to take over all forestry activity from the Forestry and Wildlife Service. Quilty's remit included making a profit as well as developing diversity in the Irish forestry sector and to promote and market Irish forestry products. To round up, here in 2016, the island has been almost completely deforested. The land use has become agricultural. The ownership of the land has changed, and agricultural policy dominated and still does the use of the land. Monocrop of trees has been introduced on marginal land, and all of this has occurred without awareness of climate change and where short-term economic policy has dominated land use and our relationship with nature.